I had sat in the middle row while the sun cut through the glass panes like a sharp promise. I scanned the chairs the way someone searches a crowd for a face they know by memory. 2 empty chairs sat where 2 bodies should have been. I felt the diplomas thrum in my hands like small birds ready to fly. My name was called and applause rose around me, warm and shiny, but it felt like a sound far away. I clapped because clapping was what people did, because the rules said I should. The applause bounced off the high ceiling and landed somewhere behind my ribs. I remember thinking the applause was for the shell of a person who had worked late, learned every line, and still had no one in the audience who would lean forward to say, "We are proud." Someone snapped a picture. The camera light looked like a tiny sun, and I smiled the way I had practiced in mirrors. I smiled for the camera and for the diploma that smelled faintly of ink and paper and late night. I smiled because I wanted to show I could be whole without them, even when my chest felt hollow. After the ceremony, people hugged and took pictures with parents, with grandparents, with people who had clapped loud and pulled out tissues at the right minute. I stood with my diploma and waited. My phone sat quiet and heavier than the paper in my hand. The empty chairs were the shape of a story I had told myself 100 times at night. I remembered the night before when my mother's voice had said another child's match meant more, and I had folded that sentence into myself like a paper plane. The plane had never left my hand. I walked away from the ceremony thinking about leaving, thinking about what I might do with the ache that wanted to make me smaller. I swore softly in the way I had learned to make promises to myself. I whispered the words under my breath so the world could not hear. Never again. I had kept the night before like a wound under my shirt. The phone call came at 10 when the sky was already the color of old bruise. My mother's voice had been even, practiced, the same calm I knew when things needed fixing. She told me my brother's match meant more to them. The words landed like stones. I had listened and then hung up with my fingers trembling. The house had sat too quiet after that. I had looked at my graduation cap on my bed, its square top a small, proud flag of black. I had run my hand over the tassel and remembered every late library night, every cup of tea gone cold on the desk. When I thought about the empty seats, I thought about all the small ways I had tried to belong. I had wanted to be seen the way heroes in movies were seen, with loud cheering, with people crying at the right place. Instead I had quiet. I had a small knot of anger that tasted like metal on my tongue. I had felt small, and then I had felt a slow heat that refused to be small. I stood and walked to the window and watched the street lamp make a line on the pavement. My bag had been half-packed for later, but later felt like a different country. I remembered my brother's face on the television when the crowd cheered for him. I remembered my parents smiling beside him like it belonged to them. I had felt the old ache swell and decided it would not be the thing that kept me frozen. I made a promise that night. I would leave the quiet and make something loud enough that absence would not find a hiding place. I slept with the promise like a warm stone in my fist. They asked a classmate to take a picture of me after the ceremony. I remember the camera clicking and the way my hand curled around the diploma as though it might fall. I smiled because a smile looked brave in photographs. The flash made the room seem larger, and for a second the empty space, where my parents should have been, looked shrunken like a shadow. My classmate put an arm around my shoulder for the shot and said something kind about the future. I laughed politely and left the laugh at the back of my throat. Later that evening someone posted the picture in a group chat and people wrote congratulations. The words piled on the screen like confetti. I felt a strange mixture of pride and weight, like carrying both a bright stone and a heavy sack. I had kept the photo in my wallet for weeks, as if keeping it close would make the memory softer. When I looked at it, I could see the empty chairs behind me as clearly as if they were carved into the photograph. I went through my things to find an old picture of my family when my brother had taken first prize at something years ago. The picture had them smiling and bright like a poster. I set my graduation photo beside it. 2 pictures, 2 different stories. I felt like a person standing between 2 doors and knowing both would not open for him at once. The paper in my wallet rustled as I tucked my diploma back in its folder. I had tried to sleep, but the room kept replaying the small moments. The camera flash, the empty chairs, the way people hugged their parents. I felt tired and hollow and strangely determined. I decided to keep my picture with me not because it completed me, but because it reminded me what I wanted to build when I stopped waiting. The walk home felt like a long road that had trapped time in its shoes. Rain came soft at first, then in strict lines. My diploma folder had a little water on the corner. The streetlights made puddles glow like tiny moons on the pavement. I passed families walking with their own proud children. They laughed and pointed and held hands. I watched them like someone reading from a book about a life I had not been given. My phone buzzed once and it was my parent. The message said, "Hope it went well." The words felt light and far away, like they were sent from another life. I stood under a tree and let the rain make a tiny river down my sleeve. I had a small sharp laugh because of the way the words missed me. I wanted to shout back every hurt, every empty moment, but instead I typed, "It was fine," and hit send. The reply was quick and shallow, like a paper boat. I kept walking and thought about how our lives sometimes break into different colors. My brother's name was already on a billboard farther down the road celebrating his win. It felt like a bright needle poking me. I had learned to measure myself by small victories in quiet rooms. The rain made my hair stick to my forehead, and my shoes sloshed through shallow puddles. When I reached my house, I stood for a long time outside the door, diploma under my arm, the rain cooling the heat in my face. I set the folder on the table and sat at the kitchen counter with instant noodles because it felt like the right small punishment and the right small comfort. I remember thinking about the empty chairs again and feeling a hard, gentle decision forming inside me. Please subscribe, like and share for more, thanks. I ate the instant noodles slowly. The steam fogged my glasses and the noodles tasted like nothing and everything at once. I set my diploma on the table like a small trophy that no one else wanted to hold. It felt heavy and important and lonely. I had always imagined dinner after my graduation would be loud and full, the plates clinking and the talk running on. Instead I had the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the kettle's little sigh. I whispered to the empty room, "Never again," like a promise spoken into a dark well. I knew then that the word never could be a bright sword or it could be a warm shield. I wanted it to be a sword that carved a new path. I took out paper and wrote a short note that said, "Don't wait up. You already missed it." I folded the note and left it on the kitchen table where anyone could find it. I felt a strange calm when I left the house that night. The bus stop smelled like old rain and leftover city. I sat on the bus and watched the city blur past, houses and street lamps running like film. I had a bag with a few clothes and a small wallet. The bus hummed and I thought about the printing shop where I had once done a few small jobs, about the smell of ink and the quiet of late work. I watched the lights of the city fall away and felt like someone setting out with little more than a promise and a heavy heart. I slept on the bus for a while and dreamed of building something that could not be ignored. The bus rocked gently as it carried me away from everything I had known. The rain had stopped by dawn, and the city lights were behind me now, replaced by wide fields and fog. I watched the sky pale through the window. The note I had left on the table felt like both a farewell and a quiet scream. I didn't know where I was heading, but I knew where I would not return. At least not as the same person. When the bus stopped at a small town, I stepped off with my single bag and my folder still tucked under my arm. I wandered until I found a narrow street where the smell of ink drifted through an open door. A sign above said Riley Printing and Binding. The man inside, gray hair, sleeves rolled, looked up from a press and asked if I was looking for work. I nodded. He told me to start by sweeping the floor. Days passed, then weeks. I cleaned presses, trimmed paper, and watched the machines breathe like old animals. Mr. Riley spoke little but noticed much. Sometimes I caught him studying me, perhaps recognizing the hunger in my work. Every night, I returned to the small room I rented above the bakery across the street. I'd take out my diploma, the one no one clapped for, and remind myself that silence could be a seed. One evening, Mr. Riley handed me a stack of misprinted certificates. "Try fixing these," he said. I stayed late, adjusting fonts, smoothing colors, learning the rhythm of ink. He returned in the morning, looked at my work, and smiled. "You've got an eye," he said. "How'd you end up here?" I just shrugged and said, "Looking for a fresh page." He nodded slowly. "Then let's start one." That night, I went home feeling something strange, a spark I had not felt in years. The printing shop became my world. I learned how paper could carry dreams, how ink could give voice to pride. I ran my fingers over embossed letters and thought about how much beauty could come from pressure. Mr. Riley often left me in charge when he ran errands, trusting me with the presses. The machines thudded and hissed, steady as a heartbeat. One afternoon, a customer came in with an urgent order. It was for a local charity that needed diplomas printed for children graduating from an orphanage program. The man said the budget was small but the smiles would be big. Mr. Riley agreed immediately, and I offered to help after hours. I stayed late that night. The shop smelled of warm ink and glue. As I pressed each child's name onto the thick white paper, I imagined their faces. Children who might not have anyone clapping either, yet who would hold these papers like gold. When I delivered the stack to the charity the next morning, a group of kids was waiting. They laughed, touched the letters, and thanked me like I had handed them sunlight. Something inside me cracked open. Their joy filled a place in me that had been empty too long. When I returned to the shop, Mr. Riley was standing by the counter with his arms folded. He said, "You stayed all night, didn't you?" I nodded. He smiled. "Keep that heart. It'll take you farther than talent ever will." As I wiped the ink from my hands, I noticed a man in a tweed coat at the doorway. He picked up one of the leftover certificates, studied it, and turned to me. "You're Noah Carter, right?" My name on a stranger's tongue made me freeze. "Yes, sir." He smiled kindly. "Top of your class, if I recall correctly. What are you doing here?" The man's question hung in the air like smoke. I didn't know whether to be proud or ashamed. "Working," I said simply. He studied me a moment longer before offering his hand. "Professor Lang," he introduced himself. The name hit me with a wave of memory. He had once taught a guest seminar at my university. We spoke briefly. He told me he was helping organize a scholarship event in the city. He admired the quality of my prints and said, "You have a gift for presentation, Mr. Carter." Before leaving, he handed me his card. "If you ever want to do something more meaningful than invoices and letterheads, call me." Then he was gone, leaving the doorbell's soft ring behind. That night, I sat in my rented room, staring at his card under the weak light of a single bulb. The words University Scholarship Fund glimmered in gold print. My chest tightened. I thought about the kids from the orphanage and how proud they had been holding their certificate. Maybe this was a sign. Maybe printing wasn't just ink and paper. It could be hope. The next morning, I told Mr. Riley about the meeting. He looked proud but a little sad. "You were meant for more, Noah," he said. "If you get a chance, take it. Just promise you'll visit." A week later, I called the number on the card. Professor Lang invited me to assist him with preparations for a donor event. "It's not glamorous," he said, "but I think you'll find purpose there." When I arrived, I wore my best shirt and carried my old diploma folder under my arm. As I stepped into the university hall again, the scent of polished wood and possibility filled the air. It felt like walking into my past, only this time I intended to stay long enough to change the ending. Professor Lang greeted me warmly. "Noah, my boy, I was hoping you'd come." He led me into a large room filled with boxes of envelopes, ribbons, and blank certificates. "We're preparing for a donor event this weekend. Think you can help design the layout?" I nodded, my hands itching to begin. For 2 days, we worked side by side, crafting elegant certificates for scholarship donors and recipients. Lang spoke about the importance of opportunity, How education could rebuild lives. I listened and poured care into every stroke of ink, every border. Late one night, while I adjusted the printer's settings, I overheard two staff members talking outside the door. "They're setting up a new scholarship fund next month," one said. "The director wants someone trustworthy to manage it." The words stayed with me. I had spent years trying to be worthy of something: approval, applause, love. Maybe trust was a better prize. When the event day came, the hall gleamed with lights and music. Guests in formal wear admired the display of printed awards. Lang introduced me to several attendees, calling me the talent behind the beauty. Among them was a man in a dark suit who studied me with keen eyes. "You designed these?" he asked. "Yes, sir." "Impressive work." He handed me his card without another word. The gold letters read Evan Monroe, philanthropist. Lang leaned toward me after he left. "He's funding the new scholarship program," he whispered. I felt my heartbeat quicken. Maybe life was folding open again, one carefully printed page at a time. That night, as I helped clean up the hall, Lang placed a hand on my shoulder. "Sometimes," he said softly, "our second chances arrive disguised as work." A few days later, Professor Lang called me into his office. His desk was neat except for a single envelope resting on top. He smiled. "I recommended you for a position, Noah." My heart skipped. "A position?" He nodded. "Scholarship coordinator. You'd oversee communications and design materials for our donor foundation." My first instinct was disbelief. "But I'm not qualified." "You are," he interrupted. "You just don't believe it yet." He arranged an interview for me that same week. I borrowed a worn gray suit from Mr. Riley and polished my old shoes until I could see my face in them. When I entered the tall glass building downtown, my reflection in the elevator looked both nervous and new. Inside the office, Mr. Monroe greeted me himself. "Professor Lang spoke highly of you," he said, scanning my resume. "Tell me, why do you want this role?" I hesitated, then said, "Because I know what it feels like to be unseen. And I want to make sure others aren't." He leaned back, thoughtful. After a moment, he smiled. "You're not like the others." Those words felt like a key turning in an old lock. By the end of the day, I received the call. "Congratulations, Mr. Carter. Welcome aboard." I sat on a park bench afterward, watching sunlight flicker through trees. For the first time in years, I felt something lighter than ambition, purpose. I whispered to myself, maybe this is what real invitations feel like. I thought about the boy who had eaten noodles alone and realized he was still here, but he was learning to rise. The first day at the foundation felt like stepping into a world painted in brighter colors. The building was full of glass, light, and quiet footstep. I had a small desk by the window, a computer that hummed softly, and a stack of blank letters waiting for me to fill them with hope. My task was to design the acceptance letters for new scholarship recipients, students who, like me, had known what it meant to struggle for recognition. I poured everything I had into those letters. Each font, each word, each fold of the paper mattered. They weren't just letters, they were proof that someone believed in them. As I signed the last one, I whispered, "This is what a real invitation feels like." It wasn't for me this time, but it healed something inside me anyway. Professor Lang visited my office later that week. He leaned on the doorway, smiling proudly. "You're doing well, Noah. The board noticed your work." I told him how much it meant to help others like me. He nodded. "That's why you'll rise, son. You care." When the first batch of letters went out, I imagined every student opening theirs. I pictured their eyes widening, their hearts racing. That night, as I lay in bed, I remembered my own empty mailbox years ago, the silence that followed my achievements. This time, I was the silence breaker. I printed my name at the bottom of each acceptance letter, small but visible, designed by Noah Carter. It wasn't pride, it was acknowledgement. The next morning, a student sent an email to thank me. She said, "Your letter felt like someone finally saw me." I sat at my desk for a long time after reading that, smiling quietly. Maybe that was all I ever wanted, to be seen and to help others feel the same. One morning, I picked up a newspaper from the cafe across the street. The front page showed my brother holding another trophy, my parents beaming beside him. The headline read, "Local Star Wins National Championship." I froze. The photo was too bright, too perfect. My mother's smile hadn't changed. My father's proud tilt of the chin was exactly how I remembered it. My brother stood tall in his uniform, shining under stadium lights. For a moment, the air around me went quiet. I stared at the picture until the words blurred. Then I folded the paper neatly, tucked it under my arm, and walked to work. Inside the foundation, I kept busy. I reviewed applications, answered calls, and helped organize donation drives. Work became my refuge, a steady rhythm that drowned out the noise of memory. At lunch, Professor Lang noticed the newspaper on my desk. "That your brother?" he asked gently. I nodded once. "You don't talk much about your family." "There's not much to say," I replied. He looked at me for a long moment. "Sometimes distance isn't punishment, it's preparation." That night, I thought about those words. I realized that while my family was busy shining under spotlights, I was building my own kind of light, quieter, steadier, and meant to last. Before sleeping, I unfolded the newspaper one last time and stared at their smiles. Then I placed it in a drawer, closed it softly, and whispered, "Keep your trophies. I'll build legacies." The world didn't need to see me on a podium. It would see my work in the lives of others. And maybe, one day they would see it too. It was a cold Thursday when I saw a young intern sitting alone in the break room, staring at an empty lunchbox. Her name was Maya. She had come from a small town, just like I once had. I asked, "Did you forget lunch?" She shook her head. "Couldn't afford one today. Rent's due." Without thinking, I walked to the cafe and came back with 2 sandwiches. I handed one to her. "Eat," I said simply. She blinked, surprised. "You don't have to." "I know," I replied. "That's why I'm doing it." We ate together, talking quietly. She told me about her dreams to study design, how she worked 2 jobs to stay in school. Her honesty reminded me of myself at her age, full of hope and hurt at the same time. The next day, someone told Professor Lang what I'd done. He smiled and said, "Good hearts rise slow, but high." Word spread around the office. People began leaving small notes on my desk. Thank yous, encouragements, even requests for advice. I hadn't meant to be noticed, but kindness has its own way of shining. That week, Mr. Monroe called me into his office. "Noah, I hear you've been lifting morale around here," he said with a grin. "Keep it up. Leadership isn't just about titles, it's about presence." I walked out of his office feeling humbled, but also something else, seen. That night, I looked out my window at the city lights and whispered, "Good hearts rise slow." I wondered if maybe mine finally had. The promotion came on a rainy Monday. The board called me in, and Mr. Monroe handed me an envelope. Inside was a letter naming me assistant director of the foundation. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I looked up, half expecting someone to tell me it was a mistake. But Mr. Monroe smiled. "You earned this, Noah. You've changed the tone of this place." The room burst into applause. It wasn't the empty kind I had once heard at graduation. It was warm, genuine, filled with respect. Later that afternoon, I walked through the lobby and saw a new plaque being mounted on the donor wall. Among the engraved names, near the bottom, I saw it, Noah Carter. My chest tightened. I traced my fingers over the letters, feeling the cool metal under my skin. It wasn't fame or revenge. It was proof that quiet effort mattered. I sent a short message to Mr. Riley. Still printing good things, just on different paper. He replied minutes later, "Proud of you, son. Keep making meaning." That night, I stood by my window as lightning flickered over the city skyline. I thought about how far I'd come since that rainy walk home with a soaked diploma. I smiled softly and said to myself, "This is my new beginning." Outside, thunder rolled like applause, only this time it didn't feel hollow. I was reviewing scholarship applications when my phone rang. The screen showed a name I hadn't seen in years, Mom. My fingers froze before I answered. Her voice trembled. Noah, it's been so long. How are you? I'm fine, I said, steady but guarded. She hesitated. We need your help. Your brother made a bad investment. We're in trouble. The bank's threatening foreclosure. Her words landed heavily, but I kept my tone even. I'll see what I can do. There was silence. You'd really help us? After everything? Yes, I said quietly. Because it's what I'd want someone to do for me. When we hung up, I sat for a long time, staring at the city beyond my office window. I thought about how far I'd come from the boy who waited for them in an empty hall. That night, I went through the Foundation's anonymous donation portal. I transferred enough to cover their mortgage, under the name A Friend. I didn't want their thanks, I wanted peace. The next morning, I saw a post online. My parents thanking a miracle donor for saving their home. They didn't know it was me, and I didn't need them to. I closed my laptop, breathed deeply, and whispered, sometimes love doesn't have to be seen to be real. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was the beginning of it. The following week, I visited my parents' hometown quietly. I didn't tell anyone. I only wanted to see the house from a distance, to make sure it still stood. The roof had new tiles, and the garden looked freshly trimmed. They had written online about their miracle, how some kind soul had saved them. I stood across the street and listened to their laughter through an open window. It was strange. After all those years of silence, the sound didn't hurt anymore. It only felt far away. I slipped a letter into their mailbox with no return name, just one sentence. Sometimes blessings wear quiet faces. Then I walked away. Back at work, I threw myself into projects again. Mr. Monroe had me oversee the planning of next year's scholarship expansion. I found a sense of peace in the purpose. I met dozens of students whose stories mirrored my own, bright eyes, tired hearts, hope flickering inside them. Helping them helped me. That night, I sat alone in my office long after everyone had left. My reflection on the glass looked like two people, the man I had become and the boy who once begged for attention. I thought about forgiveness. It was not about letting them off the hook. It was about letting myself breathe again. I whispered to my reflection, I'm done waiting for their applause. Outside, the street lights blinked against the window, steady and soft. The world kept turning. And for once, I didn't feel left behind. The idea came during a board meeting when Mr. Monroe asked, what more can we do to make our work last? The question hung in the air, but my heart already knew the answer. I stood. We build something permanent, a place that honors perseverance, not privilege. A hall for those who rose despite being unseen. The room went quiet. Then, one by one, people nodded. Tell us more, Mr. Monroe said. I described a building filled with stories of students who had overcome hardship, walls lined with plaques, photos, and letters of gratitude. A space that could inspire every visitor to believe that pain could turn into purpose. The proposal passed unanimously. They named me project head. When the meeting ended, I went back to my desk and sat in silence. For years, I had wanted to be remembered. Now I was helping build a memory for everyone like me. That evening, I wrote in my notebook, legacy is not about being seen, it's about what remains when you're gone. I stayed late sketching designs, thinking about light, space, and names. One name, in particular, stayed on the page, Carter Hall of Honor. I smiled faintly. It wasn't about family pride, it was about reclaiming a name that once felt heavy. When I told Professor Lang, he said, "You've turned your scars into blueprints, Noah. That's rare." And for the first time, I truly believed him. I stood before the architectural model of the hall weeks later, tracing the small letters etched above its doorway, Carter Hall of Honor. The board loved it, the donors approved, and the project was fully funded. Seeing my family name on something noble felt like rewriting my own history. I spent months supervising construction. The workers joked and played music while laying brick. Every day I walked through the dust and noise with quiet pride. I often thought about how strange it was to build something so full of life from a story born of emptiness. When the foundation stone was placed, Mr. Monroe asked, "Will your family attend the opening?" I paused. "They'll get their invitation." Later that night, I sat at my desk surrounded by elegant gold-edged envelope. I wrote every name carefully, saving my parents for last. My hand trembled as I wrote Mr. and Mrs. Carter. For years, I had wanted them to see my worth. Now they would, but on my terms. I sealed the envelope with wax and pressed the foundation's emblem into it. Watching the seal harden felt symbolic, like closing a wound. Before leaving the office, I whispered, "Let them come. Let them see what they missed." The invitation glimmered under the desk lamp, a golden promise they couldn't decline. The hall rose slowly, brick by brick, like a dream solidifying. Each morning, I walked through the construction site wearing a hard hat and holding blueprints. Workers called me boss now, a title that still felt strange. Every plaque was engraved with care. Each student's story was polished and mounted, tales of struggle, triumph, and redemption. When I looked around, I didn't just see walls. I saw hundreds of lives stitched together with resilience. One afternoon, the chief architect asked, "Should we send invitations to your family?" I hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Yes. I'll handle it personally." That night, I stayed alone in the design studio, sorting through the final batch of invitations. My parents' names waited at the top of the list. I placed their envelope on the stack last, pressing it down firmly. The edges caught the light like gold armor. The next morning, couriers were dispatched across cities and towns. I watched the delivery van pull away with quiet satisfaction. Among those hundreds of names was the one that had once caused me pain, but now it was just part of the story. As the van disappeared, I felt something inside me settle. The boy who once waited for their attention was gone. The man who built a monument to perseverance had taken his place. I imagined their faces when the courier arrived at their door. The thought made my chest tighten. That morning, I stood by the window of my office as sunlight filtered through, picturing the moment perfectly. Somewhere miles away, my father would open the door, sign for the envelope, and read aloud the elegant words printed in gold. "You are cordially invited to the grand opening of Carter Hall of Honor." My mother would cover her mouth, whispering, "Maybe he forgave us." And maybe, in a way, I had, but not as they imagined. At noon, I received a message from the courier confirming all deliveries were completed. I stared at the screen, feeling both nervous and calm. There was no turning back now. That evening, I walked through the nearly finished hall. The marble floors reflected the soft glow of ceiling lights. I ran my hand along the railing and thought of that lonely graduation day. The same hands that had clutched a soaked diploma now touched something eternal. A large banner hung near the entrance, "Opening Ceremony, this weekend." I stood in the quiet hall, listening to the echo of my footstep. My voice, low but steady, filled the space. "This time, they'll have front row seats." The hall stood like a living testament, waiting for the past to meet the present. The courier's confirmation replayed in my mind for hours. I could almost see the van winding through our old neighborhood, stopping at that familiar gate, and handing over the envelope that gleamed with gold edges. My parents' address looked strange when I wrote it, like something that belonged to someone else's life. They must have received it by evening. I pictured my father coming home from work, tired, his hands rough from years of routine. My mother would be in the kitchen, the smell of something simple on the stove. The knock on the door would surprise them. My father would sign the delivery slip, puzzled. "Invitation?" he'd ask. I could almost hear her gasp as she read. "You are cordially invited to the grand opening of Carter Hall of Honor, founded by director Noah Carter." There would be silence after that, deep and long. I imagined my mother touching the embossed gold seal, whispering, "He remembered us." My father, ever proud, would try to hide his guilt behind a nod. Maybe he forgave us, she'd say, her eyes shining with hope. But I knew the truth. This wasn't revenge. It was revelation. I wanted them to see the weight of absence turned into light. That night, I sat in the empty hall again. The marble floor shone under the spotlights. I placed 2 chairs in the front row and stood staring at them for a long time. Those chairs weren't for reconciliation. They were reminders, symbols of what was once missing and what it had built in me. When I left the hall, I whispered, "Let them come. Let them see what love in silence creates." 2 days later, as the city prepared for the grand opening, my parents packed their suitcases. I wasn't there, but I could imagine every moment with unnerving clarity. My father dusted off his old black suit, the one he had worn to my brother's award banquets. My mother ironed a faded dress and borrowed shoes from a neighbor. "He must be successful now," my father said, tying his tie with trembling fingers. "He always was," my mother replied softly. They moved like people walking on eggshells, balancing guilt and hope. I could see my father checking his reflection, trying to look proud but not desperate. And then there was my brother. He lounged on the couch, watching them with narrowed eyes. "You really think he wants to see you?" he scoffed. "He's probably still bitter. You're walking into humiliation." My father frowned. "He invited us, didn't he? Maybe he just wants you to feel what he felt," the brother sneered. I imagined my mother's quiet sigh, the kind she used when she knew words wouldn't fix anything. "We have to go," she would say, "no matter what he feels." They packed everything carefully, borrowed perfume, shined shoes, false confidence. My father folded the invitation and tucked it into his jacket pocket like a passport. That night, I stood by my apartment window and looked toward the horizon where their small town lay hidden in the dark. Somewhere out there, they were preparing to face the sun they once forgot. And I was preparing too. I whispered to myself, "This is what peace sounds like." The morning of their trip, the sun rose over the highway like a spotlight. I woke early, restless. The city buzzed with preparation for the grand opening. Banners fluttered in the streets, and reporters were already setting up their cameras. Meanwhile, miles away, my parents loaded their old car. My mother carried the invitation carefully in her purse, as though afraid it might disappear. My father turned on the ignition, the engine sputtering before catching. "Let's hope he's happy to see us," he murmured. "I just want him to know we're proud," she said, though her eyes were wet. As they drove, the radio played cheerful songs that didn't match their thoughts. They talked about me, about old times, about what they might say when we met. My father tried to sound confident, but guilt sat between them like a passenger. They passed towns and billboards until one, brighter than the rest, caught their eyes. Carter Hall of Honor, opening this weekend. My mother pressed her hand to her chest. "It's real," she whispered. For the rest of the drive, they were silent. Back in the city, I walked through the finished hall with the event team. Everything was ready: the red carpet, the floral arrangements, the sound system. Reporters would arrive at 6, donors by 7. I paused in front of the engraved plaque near the entrance, tracing the gold letters of my own name. I took a deep breath. Today, I told myself, isn't about revenge. It's about showing what silence built. Still, I couldn't deny the tremor in my hands. Even strength has memory. By the time my parents arrived at the city, evening light draped the skyline in gold. They parked near the venue, adjusting their borrowed clothes. I watched from the upper balcony as guests began to gather below, scholars, donors, teachers, faces glowing with anticipation. The hall's music drifted gently, strings rising with warmth. My parents stepped inside together, hesitating at the entrance. My father held the invitation tightly. My mother clutched her purse like a shield. They looked around in awe. Marble floors, towering pillars, portraits of smiling graduates. It must have felt like another world. My mother's eyes shimmered. "He built this," she whispered. I stayed hidden behind a pillar, watching. I could see the questions flickering across their faces. Where do we stand in this story? An usher approached them politely. Welcome, Mr. and Mrs. Carter. Please, take your seats. The director will address you soon. They nodded, unsure. My father straightened his jacket. My mother smoothed her dress. They walked toward the front row, unaware I was already there, just beyond the curtain. The music swelled as lights dimmed. My heart pounded. Years of silence, pain, and growth, all converging into this one night. When I finally stepped toward the stage entrance, I could see them through the thin veil of fabric. My father's hand rested on my mother's. Their faces were expectant, afraid, hopeful. And I thought, maybe now they'll understand. The lights brightened as I stepped onto the stage. The applause was thunderous, but this time it wasn't hollow. I saw the audience rise to their feet, cameras flashing, people cheering. And then I saw them. Front row. My father's jaw tight, my mother's hands trembling. Their eyes locked on me, disbelief mixing with pride and guilt. I smiled, not out of joy but peace. As the applause faded, I approached the podium. Good evening, I began, my voice steady. Thank you for being here to celebrate something far greater than a building. This hall stands for perseverance, for every person who kept going when no one showed up to clap. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. I continued, letting the words flow from the wound that once defined me. Years ago, I graduated alone. 2 empty seats sat where my parents should have been. I thought that absence meant failure. I was wrong. It meant foundation. The room was silent except for the faint hum of air conditioning. My parents sat frozen. I built this hall, I said softly, not to remind the world of pain, but to honor what pain can build. I caught my mother's eyes for a second, hers filled instantly. The audience erupted in applause again, unaware of the full story beneath my calm smile. Behind the applause, my parents sat motionless, their past echoing back at them from the marble walls. And I, standing under the lights, felt the final piece of the promise I'd made long ago click into place. The applause faded into a hush as I adjusted the microphone. The spotlight burned warmly against my skin, but inside I was calm, steadier than I had ever been. My parents sat in the front row, barely breathing. I could feel their eyes on me, but I didn't flinch. I used to think success was about being seen, I said, scanning the crowd. That applause proved worth. But what I learned is that the quiet moments, the ones when no one's looking, build who we truly are. The audience nodded softly, leaning closer. I saw young students wiping tears, older donors smiling with pride. But my focus stayed on those 2 familiar faces below. My parents once taught me discipline and strength, I continued. And even when life drifted apart, their lessons followed me. Tonight, I thank every teacher, friend, and stranger who stood in those empty seats when no one else could. My voice steadied on purpose. Because absence can teach presence. A soft murmur swept through the room. I took a step back from the podium, allowing the words to linger. My father's lips parted, perhaps to speak, but he didn't. My mother gripped the edge of her seat, her eyes glistening. I nodded toward them once, no bitterness, no anger. Just truth. Then I turned to the audience again. This hall, I said, gesturing to the grand walls around us, is for every student who felt forgotten. For every dream that survived silence. The applause came again, louder this time, shaking the chandeliers. And through that thunder of approval, I watched my parents crumble quietly in their seats, faces pale, hearts heavy. The sound they had once denied me was now everywhere. After the applause, the hall fell into stillness again. I leaned on the podium and spoke softly, letting each word find its mark. Years ago, I stood on another stage, a graduation stage. I looked out into the crowd and saw 2 empty chairs. That image stayed with me like a shadow. Gasps rippled through the audience. My parents froze. I wondered then, I continued, if those seats would ever be filled. But tonight, I realized something important. Empty chairs can still teach presence. A few people in the audience nodded, some wiped away quiet tears. I could feel my parents' confusion, whether I was forgiving them or condemning them. The truth was neither. I was revealing. I spent years chasing applause, thinking it could fill the silence. But applause fades. Purpose doesn't. This hall isn't revenge. It's remembrance. It's proof that pain, when transformed, can build miracles. A woman in the second row began clapping softly. Others joined, hesitant at first, then stronger. The applause became waves again. I stepped away from the podium, allowing the crowd to see the banner behind me. It shimmered under the golden lights, half hidden by a velvet curtain. "Before we continue," I said, "I'd like to share one final dedication." My voice cracked, not from weakness but from release. This hall is dedicated to those who taught me the hardest lesson of all, that sometimes love doesn't arrive in attendance, but in absence. My hand motioned toward the rope hanging from the ceiling. A quiet gasp filled the hall. I took the rope, pulled it down, and the curtain began to fall. The banner unfurled slowly from the rafters, the golden letters catching the light. Dedicated to those who believed absence teaches presence. The room went still. People rose from their seats to read the inscription more closely. Cameras flashed, reporters whispered, and yet I heard nothing but the sound of my parents' breaths from the front row. My mother's eyes filled with tears that trembled but didn't fall. My father looked as if the ground beneath him had shifted. I stepped forward, my voice soft but strong. This hall doesn't exist because I was supported. It exists because I learned to stand when no one did. There was no malice, no bitterness, just quiet clarity. A woman near the back began to clap again, slowly. Then others followed, until the sound filled every corner of the hall. I bowed slightly, not as a victor, but as someone finally released from waiting. When I looked back up, my parents were still seated. My mother mouthed something I couldn't hear, maybe my name. My father's hand trembled as he touched the edge of his chair, perhaps unsure whether to rise. I stepped away from the stage, letting the applause swell around me. I had imagined this moment 1,000 times, but reality was gentler. It didn't feel like revenge, it felt like closure. As I walked off stage, I felt light for the first time in years. The crowd stood, cheering and clapping, but I didn't look back. I only heard the echoes. Behind me, the banner still swayed slightly, its golden words shimmering above my parents' bowed heads. Dedicated to those who believed absence teaches presence. My mother's sobs were soft but audible. My father's hands shook as he covered his face. The people around them began whispering. Some recognized who they were. Others simply watched. I paused at the edge of the hall, hidden behind a column. The applause still thundered, but I wasn't listening anymore. I was thinking of that boy who once sat alone at a kitchen table, whispering, "Never again." He had kept his word. When the ceremony ended, I stayed out of sight as reporters swarmed the stage. My parents slipped quietly through the crowd, their heads lowered. Outside, the night was cool, the city lights sharp and endless. I stood beneath them, breathing deeply, knowing the story had come full circle. The applause had once been hollow. Now it was holy. And this time, I didn't need anyone to clap for me. The crowd began to leave, the echo of applause fading into memory. I stayed in the wings, watching the guests shake hands and take photos. My parents remained seated for a long time, frozen in silence. Finally, I walked toward them. My footsteps echoed against the marble, each one steady, deliberate. My mother looked up first. Her eyes were red, her lips trembling. My father's jaw clenched as if holding back words. I stopped beside their row, just close enough for them to hear my voice. "Tonight," I said quietly, "I invited everyone who ever felt unseen to stand." And they did. I looked around at the hundreds of people still talking, laughing, alive. Then I turned back to my parents. "You don't have to stand. You already taught me what absence can do." Their faces broke, my mother's hand reaching halfway toward me before falling back to her lap. I didn't say another word. I simply stepped past them and walked down the aisle, the crowd parting as I moved. Outside, cool night air met my face. The sounds of celebration faded behind me. I stood under the glowing sign of Carter Hall of Honor and exhaled. The boy who once waited for 2 empty chairs had finally walked away from them. The next morning, headlines filled the newsstands. Carter Hall opens to standing ovation. My photo was on the front page, smiling, confident, successful. No one could tell from that picture that the night before had been the softest kind of storm inside me. Reporters camped outside the building, calling my name for quote. I gave short, calm answers. It's not about me, I said. It's about those who rose despite being unseen. But somewhere else in the city, another story was unfolding. My parents had slipped out of the hall unnoticed. A friend later told me they looked pale, shaken. When they returned home, their neighbors were already talking. We saw your son on TV, someone said. He's remarkable. Remarkable. The word must have cut and healed at once. Inside their small house, I imagined silence stretching between them. My father would sit in his old chair, staring at the floor. My mother would touch the invitation still folded in her purse. I didn't see them, but I knew. The absence that once belonged to me now belonged to them. At the foundation the next day, Professor Lang stopped by my office. You did what most can't, he said. You told the truth without cruelty. I nodded. Truth doesn't always need to hurt, it just needs to stand. That evening, I stood outside Carter Hall again. The lights glowed softly through the glass. People walked by taking pictures, smiling at the plaque. I looked up at the words engraved above the entrance and whispered, "Let the silence end here." For the first time, I didn't feel alone. A week later, my brother showed up at my office without warning. He came dressed in a wrinkled shirt, his eyes sharp with anger. I hadn't seen him in years. "So that's it," he said, slamming his hand on my desk. "You humiliated our parents in front of the world?" I stayed seated, calm. I didn't humiliate anyone. I told the truth. They were crying, Noah, he snapped. People were whispering. You think that's justice? I met his gaze evenly. No. I think that's reflection. He leaned forward, voice low. You made them look like monsters. I took a slow breath. They didn't need my help for that. The truth did. He froze. For a moment, the silence between us was heavier than words. Then I softened my tone. You were always the golden one. You had their love, their presence. I had the silence. I turned it into something beautiful. Why does that make you angry? He didn't answer. He only looked at me with something between guilt and resentment. When he finally left, the echo of the door closing felt final. I sat for a while, staring at the reflection of the city lights on my office window. I realized then that the revenge I'd imagined long ago had turned into something else entirely. Truth without fire, forgiveness without words. I whispered into the stillness, I don't need them to see me anymore. And I meant it. Days passed, and life carried on. Awards, interviews, meetings, it all blurred into motion. But one night, I drove back to the town I had left behind. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. The streets looked smaller than I remembered. Street lights flickered, and the air smelled of rain. When I reached my old house, the curtains were half drawn. Through the window, I saw my father sitting alone in the living room. He wasn't the towering man I remembered. He looked smaller, fragile, his shoulders slumped forward. The walls behind him were lined with fading photographs, my brother's trophies, our family portraits. But one thing caught my eye, a yellowed piece of paper taped to the wall near his chair. I moved closer to the window and squinted. It was one of my childhood drawings, a stick figure family holding hands under a bright sun. My handwriting beneath it read, Us Forever. My chest tightened. He was staring at it, unmoving, his eyes red. Then, slowly, he covered his face with his hands and broke down sobbing. I turned away, unable to watch. The man who once valued presence only when it was loud now sat alone in a house echoing with regret. I whispered, Now you know what silence feels like. I didn't knock. I didn't go inside. I just stood there until the rain started falling, washing over everything, the glass, the memories, the ache. Then I walked away, leaving the lights of that house glowing faintly behind me. A few days later, a letter arrived at my office, handwritten, the script delicate and trembling. I recognized it immediately. My mother. I hesitated before opening it. The envelope felt heavier than paper should. Inside, her words were careful, raw. Noah, I see you now. We were blind to what truly mattered. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know, every empty seat, every missed applause, I regret them all. We love you, even if we never knew how to show it. Please come home, just once, so I can tell you this in person. I folded the letter slowly, my throat tight. Then I opened my desk drawer and took out my old diploma, the one that once sat alone on the dinner table. I slid her letter beside it, closed the drawer, and whispered, "Some words don't need answering." It wasn't cruelty. It was peace. That night, I sat in the dark office, the city humming beyond the windows. I thought about all the years I had wanted to hear those words. And now that they had arrived, I realized something important. Closure didn't always mean reunion. Sometimes, the most loving thing you could do was stay away. Time moved gently after that. The hall grew busier every week, filled with students and families who came to see the stories on the walls. I spent my days mentoring scholarship recipients, helping them find strength in their own struggles. One afternoon, I met a young boy named Eli. He reminded me of myself, quiet, thoughtful, always glancing toward the door as if waiting for someone who never came. When his ceremony ended, everyone cheered except the 2 seats beside him, empty. I found him outside later, sitting alone on the steps, holding his certificate. "Your parents couldn't make it?" I asked. He shook his head. "They said work's more important." I sat beside him. "I know that feeling," I said softly. He looked up. "What did you do?" "I built something they couldn't ignore," I answered. "Not for them, but for everyone like us." He smiled weakly. "Maybe I can do that too." "You can," I said. "Start small. Even a whisper can turn into a hall." As he left, I looked up at the building behind me. The glass reflected the sunset, gold and warm, just like hope. For the first time in years, I felt completely at peace with the story I had once called pain. The awards ceremony felt surreal, like reading a chapter I'd written years ago and discovering a new line I had never expected. They called my name from a podium under bright lights. I walked forward, heart steady, palms cool. The auditorium smelled of polished wood and perfume. People rose and clapped. Their faces were warm and earnest. I thought of the boy who had sat alone with noodles, of the bus rides and printing presses and late nights. I thought of the orphans' diplomas I had once pressed by hand. When the presenter spoke about the hall and its impact, I listened and let the words find their place inside me. He described how many students had found scholarships because of one small idea that grew. He mentioned the plaque, the stories, the families who now came to ceremonies. I felt gratitude rise like sunlight. After the event, photographers crowded me, microphones pointed like small metal flowers. I answered their questions as best I could. Why I'd built the hall, what I hoped it would do, who inspired me. My answers were simple and honest. I kept mentioning the word presence, how absence had taught me to create a place where presence mattered most. That evening, a reporter asked, "What inspired you?" I said, "Absence." She frowned, then nodded slowly. It was honest and not cruel. The next morning, the headline read, "From empty seats to a hall of honor." The story spread quickly. Messages arrived from people across the country. Letters, emails, small notes from people who'd been unseen. I read each one slowly, feeling the wide reach of what had once been a small ache. I sat at my desk and whispered a quiet thanks to the past. Presence had arrived, not as sudden applause, but as steady work and care. I realized then that true triumph wasn't a shout, it was a light that let others find their way. When my brother's business failed, the news came wrapped in embarrassment. A mutual acquaintance told me his company had collapsed under debts and bad choices. He called me that evening, voice tight, pride swallowed whole. He asked for help like a man stepping off a cliff and reaching for the nearest branch. For a moment, I listened without answering. I thought of all the years he'd had my parents' proud faces in the crowd, the golden trophies, the easy compliments. I also thought of how life can shift beneath anyone's feet. I offered him a simple job at the hall, reception, a steady start. He hesitated, offended that I'd proposed something modest. I told him, "I'd rather you build from here than fall farther." He accepted with a stubbornness that was almost humility. When he first showed up, he moved like a man learning new steps on a foreign floor. He was awkward with the students and clumsy with the schedule. But slowly he showed up, day after day. I watched him sweep floors, answer phones, and greet nervous families. He learned to listen to stories that were not about trophies. At first my parents resented my charity. They saw his position as humiliation. But I'd learned long ago that dignity isn't always about titles. One afternoon my brother asked for advice on a presentation he was making for a local vendor. He practiced in my office, nervous and sincere. I coached him gently, showing how to stand tall without pretending. When he left that day, he hugged me, awkward and quick, and said, "Thanks." It was small, but it was real. I realized then that offering someone a ladder was more powerful than throwing stones from a tower. Redemption, I learned, is often slow and full of work. I had the house renovated in secret. The old place where I'd once stood with a damp diploma on a rain-slick night had become a quiet monument to memory. I paid for repairs with a check labeled simply from a friend. The workers replaced the roof, painted the walls, and fixed the leaky sink. I didn't tell them I was the payer. I left a new set of keys in their mailbox with a small note. Some invitations don't need word. Weeks later, the house looked like it might belong to a family who woke early and laughed over coffee. My mother called to say a neighbor had told her about the renovations. She sounded surprised, then embarrassed, then grateful. I listened and said nothing about the check. It felt strange to watch them adjust to comfort they hadn't expected. I did not seek praise, I sought closure. I drove past the house sometimes, slowing at the corner, watching light through curtains, imagining small repairs in their routine. One afternoon my brother knocked at the door and told them I'd left the keys. My father stood in the living room looking at the photographs on the wall, older now, softer in tone. The house's warmth seemed to thaw something in him. He called me one night, voice raw and small. "Noah," he said, "we found the keys. Someone was kind." I answered, "Keep them." There was no long apology. But there was a quieter conversation that unfolded in the months after, calls that lasted longer, a visit that lasted half an hour. I had not asked for forgiveness, and I had not demanded penance. I had simply left them a place to live, and a choice. Years passed in the easy, unrushed way of things that have healed. The hall hosted graduations, readings, and quiet afternoons when students studied under skylit windows. My parents attended one of those graduations. Not the first, not the second, but one in which they sat together and watched a student they had helped with their neighborly donations walk across the stage. I spotted them in the crowd from my office window, smiles small and sincere. They caught my eye briefly. I nodded once and stepped back into the light. I watched more than I spoke. Time had reshaped us. They tried to make up for lost moments in awkward ways. Calling more often, bringing flowers they thought appropriate, showing up for a picnic with a dish they'd burned the aroma of but not the intent. Their efforts were stilted at first, but the intent was there, and intent has its own gravity. My brother found stability. He married a warm woman who taught him to laugh without winning. He sometimes worked events at the hall, now competent and calm. He thanked me once in private. "You gave me a place to start," he said. That was enough. One quiet afternoon, my mother found a photograph of me as a child, taped inside a yearbook. She sent it to me with a message: "We see you. We are proud." I saved the photo in a drawer and kept the message folded into a book I read sometimes. It was not a single, grand reconciliation but a steady, mutual learning. I had wanted them to feel the cost of their choices. Instead, I had watched them learn the cost themselves. Compassion, I realized, could be quieter and kinder than vengeance. I stood before the plaque at sunset that evening, the hall glowing amber behind me. Families came and went, laughter and soft footsteps drifting through glass doors. I traced the letters on the plaque with my thumb, feeling the cool metal. It read of perseverance and honor, of small people who'd kept going until someone noticed. I thought about every step that had led here, the empty chairs, the bus rides, the presses, the design of a single invitation. I had built a place that did not require attendance to be meaningful. It simply was. A few people stopped to speak, offering thanks and small stories of their lives changed. I listened and let their voices settle into me like rain into soil. When I looked up, I saw my parents walking toward the walkway. They paused at a respectful distance. My mother lifted her hand in a timid wave. I nodded once, enough to say I had seen them. We did not stage a dramatic reunion. Instead, we shared a series of small, good moments over months that added up to something like peace. The sunset deepened, and a youth choir began to sing from inside the hall. Their voices rose warm and bright. I felt the old aches soften into a steady warmth, less like hunger and more like a steady lamp. I thought of the boy who once vowed, never again, over noodles at a small kitchen table. He had made something that outlived his hurt. Please subscribe, like and share for more, thanks.